My name is Lieutenant Fafa Nyame. I am 35 years old. I have been a military welfare officer for 7 years, and on a Tuesday morning in May, I was called to a military hospital to sit with a soldier who had no next of kin listed and who had been unconscious for 3 days following a stroke. This is part of my work. When a serving soldier has no family to be called, welfare sits with them. We are not doctors. We are not chaplains. We are simply a presence, someone from the institution who understands what this life is and who can be there when there is no one else. I had done this before. It is quiet work. It asks something of you that is not in the job description and that you give anyway because the alternative is a person lying in a hospital bed entirely alone. I arrived at the ward at 0900 hours. Nurse Adisa Kumi brought me to the room. She gave me the patient's name and his unit and his age and the basic shape of his medical situation, and then she left me at the door. I went in. The room was small and clean and quiet. The soldier in the bed was in his mid-60s. Warrant Officer Benjamin Akorfa. His face was still in the way that unconscious faces are, not peaceful exactly, but removed from the ordinary work of expression. I pulled the chair close to the bed the way I always do. I sat down, and then I looked at the bedside table. There was a glass of water, a small worn Bible, a set of reading glasses folded beside it, and a photograph, framed, small, the kind of frame you carry with you rather than display. A child, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on a front step in school uniform, holding a lunchbox with both hands, squinting slightly into the sun. I looked at that child for a long moment, and then I understood that I was looking at myself.
Let me tell you what I knew about my family before that Tuesday morning. I knew that my father, Kojo Nyame, had a brother, an older brother. I had known this the way you know things that are present in a family but never spoken directly, through the texture of silences, through the careful way certain subjects were navigated, through the absence of a name that should have been there and was not. I had asked, once, when I was perhaps 12 years old. My mother, Akorfa, had told me that my father and his brother had parted ways before I was born. She had said it in the tone of someone closing a door gently but firmly, not unkindly, but with a clarity that said, "This door does not open further." I had not asked again. I had grown up knowing I had an uncle who existed somewhere and who was not part of our lives and whose name was not said in our house. I had not known he was a soldier. I had not known he had a photograph of me at 5 years old in a yellow dress standing in a garden. I had not known he had been carrying it for 30 years. The object at the center of everything was the photograph, small, framed, worn at the edges in the way of something handled often. I picked it up from the bedside table with hands that were not entirely steady. The back of the frame had a piece of tape on it. On the tape, in small handwriting, Fafa, 5th birthday, July. My name, my birthday month, my 5th birthday. My father must have sent it. At some point, in the silence, in the years of distance, my father had sent his brother a photograph of his daughter at 5 years old, and his brother had kept it, had carried it through whatever postings and years had followed, had placed it beside his bed in a military hospital where he lay unconscious with no next of kin listed, because the only family he did not feel he had the right to claim. I sat with the photograph in my hands for a long time. Then I placed it back on the bedside table exactly where it had been. I took out my phone. I called my father.
My father answered on the 3rd ring. I said his name. I told him where I was. I told him the name of the man in the bed. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who does not know that name. It was the silence of 30 years arriving at once. I want to pause here, because sitting beside an unconscious man I had never met, holding a photograph of myself at 5 years old, calling a father who had never spoken his brother's name in my presence, is the moment this story became something I had not been prepared for when I accepted a welfare assignment on a Tuesday morning. If you have ever discovered a family you did not know you had, drop a comment below. And subscribe right now, because what my father told me about his brother and what I did in the days that followed is the part that changes everything. My father came to the hospital that afternoon. He had driven 3 hours. He had not told me he was coming, he had simply ended the call and gotten into his car. He is not a man who talks about difficult things easily. He is a man who shows up. He arrived at 14:30. I met him in the corridor outside the room. He was 63 years old, and he looked in that corridor like a man carrying something he had been carrying for a very long time and had not known how to put down. We stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking. Then I opened the door to the room and he went in. I stayed in the corridor. What passed between my father and his unconscious brother in that room is not mine to tell. I was not there. I let it be theirs. My father was in the room for 40 minutes. When he came out, his face had the look of someone who has said things that needed to be said, regardless of whether they were heard. He sat down in the corridor beside me. He told me the shape of it.
The falling out had happened 32 years ago, before I was born, before my parents were married. It had been about something that had felt, at the time, like a matter of principle, a decision my father had made that his brother had opposed strongly and had said so strongly, and that my father had received as a betrayal rather than as concern. They had not spoken after that. My father had married, had had a child, had built a life. He had sent the photograph, he told me this in the corridor, in the halting way of someone excavating something long buried, because he had wanted his brother to know she existed, not as a reopening, not as an olive branch, simply as an act of, he searched for the word, witness. He had wanted someone else in the world to know that Fafa existed. He had not expected a response. He had not received one, and they had continued in their silence for 30 more years while his brother carried the photograph of a child he had never met to every posting and every bunk and every hospital bed. My father said, "I did not know he was still in the army." He said, "I did not know where he was." He said it in the voice of a man who is understanding slowly that not knowing where someone is does not mean they have not been there. Benjamin Ankra regained consciousness on Thursday, 2 days after my father came to the hospital. 2 days during which my father had returned home and I had continued my welfare visits, morning and afternoon, sitting beside a man who was beginning, the doctors said, to show signs of improvement. I was there when he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he looked at me. He did not know who I was. I said, "My name is Fafa. I am a welfare officer. You are in hospital, and you are going to be all right." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at the bedside table. He looked at the photograph. He looked back at me, and something shifted in his face. He said, "Fafa." Not a question, a recognition. I said, "Yes." He said, "You look like your father." I said, "I know." He closed his eyes. I sat beside him for another hour while he slept. The weeks that followed. Benjamin's recovery was slow and required significant support. He had no family to provide that support, or believed he had none. The hospital's welfare team, which I coordinated, managed the practical elements. But I also called my father every day, and on the 4th day, my father drove back to the hospital. He did not tell me he was coming, he simply arrived. He was carrying food his wife had cooked, my mother, Akorfa,
who had packed it in containers and labeled each one and written heating instructions on a piece of paper in her careful handwriting. He went into Benjamin's room. I did not follow him in. I sat in the corridor, and I listened to the sound of two brothers in a room for the first time in 32 years. It was not dramatic from the outside. Voices, pauses, the occasional sound of something that might have been laughter and might have been something else entirely. 45 minutes.
Then my father came out. His face looked lighter than it had in the corridor 3 weeks earlier. He said, "He wants to meet you properly when he is stronger." I said, "I know. I have been sitting with him every morning." My father looked at me for a moment. He said, "I know. He told me." Benjamin Ankara. I want to tell you who he is rather than only what happened. He is 64 years old. He joined the army at 18 and has served for 46 years. The last 17 as a warrant officer, a rank he reached and held because it suited the work he wanted to do, rather than the rank he could have climbed to. He is a careful man, a quiet man. He reads, he prays, he keeps one photograph. He had listed no next of kin on any form for 32 years because the only family he did not feel he had the right to name. He has since updated his next of kin. He listed my father, and below my father's name in the secondary contact field, he listed mine. The photograph. It is still on his bedside table. I have seen it every morning for 6 weeks of welfare visits. I have stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing something that has become ordinary. But sometimes, when I come in and he is awake and we are talking about something unremarkable, something about his recovery or the ward or the weather, I catch sight of it and I think about a man carrying a framed photograph of a child he had never met to every posting for 30 years. Carrying it because it was the only piece of a family he had, because my father had sent it as an act of witness. Because some things persist in us even when we have decided they cannot. Here is what a photograph on a bedside table taught me. Silence does not erase people. It keeps them exactly where they were when the silence began, held in place, unchanged by the years that pass around them. Present in the photographs we carry, and the names we do not say, and the questions we learn not to ask. My father had a brother for 63 years while we were growing up without one. My uncle had a niece for 30 years before he knew what she looked like grown. The silence had not erased any of it. It had only delayed it. And a welfare assignment on a Tuesday morning, the ordinary rotation of a job I have done many times, had ended the delay. I had walked into a room to sit with a stranger. I had walked out with an uncle. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. She sat with him. She stayed until she understood. That was what family does.